Okay, so welcome back to EDM. I'm excited today because we have a guest to help us share 5 things a pastor's wife knows. And in order to share those things, I have brought on my wife, Erica Van Kirk. And so we are so excited to have you today and for you to help us with the podcast. So say hi.
Hi, everybody.
Okay, so I wanted to kind of do an intro and ask you to kind of get warmed up and started. What did you think ministry was going to be like before we got married, or, you know, maybe like as we were entering ministry? And then what do you think about that compared to now? Okay.
Yep. All right. So what I expected from ministry was I pictured my pastor once I became in high school, who was like a 60-year-old man, and his sweet little wife was just standing next to him at the end of the sermon at the back of the sanctuary, and they greeted everybody and talked to everybody as they left, and they did ministry together, and everybody knew the pastor's wife and knew the pastor that they just went together and shook hands together. What I've learned and how that's different is that really people want to talk to my husband and they don't want to talk to me. And there's not really time to stand around and chat with people with him. So I think it's just changed. And especially we're at different seasons of life where we have kids and just different schedules. And so it's just not the same as a 6-year-old husband and wife who can stand around chatting with people all day long.
Right. That's true. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe someday that will be us, right? We'll be standing in the back of the church, shaking everyone's hand together. Yeah. Yeah. That could still come true. That could still. Yeah.
And everybody telling you how much they like your sermon and you did such a good job. Yeah.
Yeah. I never know what to say when people say, I'm like, I've learned that it's just important to say thank you, because they're paying you a compliment. So I just say thank you. But anyways, okay, so let's talk about these 5 things a pastor's wife knows. Now, what we did was we kind of sat down ahead of time and we talked through these things. So there's a lot of input from both of us here. But you really helped shape and guide these, which is good because it's 5 things a pastor's wife knows. Okay. But I'm going to kind of lead us through this and then we'll talk through each one. So the first one is, sometimes being a ministry family means that you don't get to go to church together. What does that mean?
This one is the biggest one. And this is the biggest, you don't realize happened. Because Bill leaves for church before we even get up in the morning. And then he doesn't come back until after we are already back home from church and have a lot of times eaten lunch. So, basically, when I go to church, I go by myself. And that's different than what I thought would happen. I thought we would be able to walk together and go to church together, sit in service, and then come home together and talk about the sermon in the car ride home. And that's just not the picture of what happens, because every time you go to church, Bill is at work and he's connecting with people and ministering to people. So yeah, that's kind of what it means, is we're not really a family unit when we're at church.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. I think that's probably, like you said, that's probably one that people don't realize, because people's picture in their mind is that they look over and they see the pastor and his wife sitting together. But the interaction that happens on Sunday morning between a pastor and his family is very little. Right. And it's interesting because when you guys show up at church, and I've already been there, the kids are always like, good morning, hi. And they come and run and give me a hug, because that's the first time they're seeing me for the day. Right. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you make the joke, you're like, hi, Pastor Bill, because that's the role that I'm in at that moment. And so we had a funny thing happen to us. I randomly came home in the middle of what would have been one of our services one day because I went to work forgetting that I had taken the Sunday off. And so I was like, I showed up at work and they're like, you're not supposed to be here. And so then I came home and I just showed up on a Sunday morning, and I've never done that in all of our years of marriage.
Nope.
And so you guys were shocked. You're like, what are you doing home on a Sunday?
Yeah, we thought something was wrong, that you weren't feeling well or something. So
yeah.
But
Yeah. And then holidays can be a challenge with that same idea as well, right?
Yeah. So holidays are just kind of, how do I put it? They're chaotic for our family because you're gone. Like for Christmas, you're gone for pretty much like 12 hours straight. And so, yeah, we just can't plan on you being around or anything. And that is I have a pro tip for any pastors' wives or ministry families is we celebrate holidays normally on Saturday before. So I used to mope about Mother's Day because I'd wake up Sunday morning and nobody would be here and my kids were too little to really, do anything about it. But then we switched it to Saturday and we just celebrate Mother's Day and Father's Day on Saturday and sometimes Easter, just because there's nothing getting in the way and we can actually focus on the person. So pro tip, celebrate holidays on Saturday if possible.
Right. Yeah. And that might be a change for some people because some people are like, it's got to be the day. Right.
Yeah.
But it's been a huge relief and good thing for our family to really move those days on days that work better. Yeah. Okay. That's a great pro tip. That brings us to number 2. Being in ministry doesn't exclude you from obstacles in marriage and raising kids. Now, this is one I kind of thought through. Because I think people often think about ministry families and they're like, well, because they love Jesus and they know the Bible, they must just there must be not any problems. And if there is a problem, then they just figure it out and they just follow Jesus through the whole thing. And it's like, well, yes, but no, because we actually deal with all the same problems other families deal with, we have conflict in our home and we have to work through that and forgive each other. We have to deal with the problems that our kids deal with, which is the same as other kids. We struggle sometimes with family discipleship, right? And sometimes, I have to really lean on Erica to lead some of that because it's difficult to do everything. And so that's a big piece of it. And even date nights sometimes are really hard to come by as a family because we're so busy.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's so many times where you have multiple nights where you have meetings. And so if we have any sort of sporting event or I'm doing ministry, then there's not a lot of wiggle room for our schedule.
Right.
And then even with the discipleship process, you're spent by the time you come home. You've been ministering all day to other people, or you've been planning for service projects or outreach projects. And then you come home and it's like, okay, now we need you to be on for discipling our children. And you don't have the mental capacity to do it. So a lot of times that means that I take on the responsibility of just initiating the conversations and drawing you into it. And so I think just getting over the idea of it has to be pastor led and I can't lead anything was a big deal.
Right. Absolutely. Did you have a pro tip for this one?
I did, especially as a ministry family. It's you have to have a group of people around you who know you 100%. So you can talk about the struggles that you're going through in your marriage and your family and a confidential community where they're not going to go and talk about it to the whole church or discuss it. And they kind of view you as a person and not just as a pastor's wife or a ministry person who has to have all the answers. So having a group of people around you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's huge. And we are blessed with some really great friends that way. So that's cool. Okay. So number 3, God has different plans for ministry than you do. What does that mean?
Yes. That means that my expectation of being a youth pastor's wife for the rest of my life was not going to happen. So I became a believer in high school, and I knew God wanted me to be a youth pastor's wife. And I just thought that was it. I'm going to be a youth pastor's wife, and I'm going to be that forever for the rest of my life. Well, we did get married, and eventually you became a student ministry pastor. But about 4 years into it, you transitioned to something else. And I was like, nope, this is not the plan. This is not what I signed up for. This is not the plan. And so I think just like, we're not always excited about the transitions that happen. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a big one. Yeah. And it was interesting to like, that was hard for our family, is to make that transition. It was hard for me even because I had the same thought as you did, really. Like I believed I was going to be the 60-year-old youth pastor complaining about lock-ins and being grumpy, like I thought I was going to be that guy and be in ministry, and we would do it, in my mind, it was like, we'd always do it together too. It's like we do all the retreats together, and we did all the trips together, and we did everything together. And then, God had different plans. And so that was a big change and hard for us as a family. It's gotten a little bit easier over time now that there's been other transitions as well, but that first one was really difficult. Did you have a pro tip about that?
I think the pro tip was just relying on Jesus and trusting God's plan for ministry instead of coming up with our own and having to stick to it.
Yeah. Yeah. God likes to do that, doesn't he? Like we set our plans and then he's like, no, I got something different in mind for you. So,
yeah, exactly.
Okay. So number 4 is wives have their own ministry and calling. And I just kind of want to say something about this real quick, because this one's, I'm passionate about this, even though it's about you, is I realized that like my ministry is not the only ministry in our household that's important, right? God has called me to be in full-time ministry, and I love it. And I believe it's really important, but it's not more important than the ministry that my wife is called to, right? We both are called to build up the body of Christ, and we've both been gifted. And so I've had to we've had to consciously figure out, and I've had to take a back seat sometimes and support you in the ministry that God's calling you to, which is student ministry. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I'm just going to pause for a second before I talk about student ministry, is that how I serve looks different in different seasons of life. So when my kids were little, and it was harder to with you being in youth ministry, it was harder to get sitters and everything. That just meant my ministry was discipling my children. Like that was my primary focus, and like caring for myself and learning more about what the Lord was calling me to. And then like serving on Sunday mornings during Sunday school wasn't really my favorite, but like I stretched out of my comfort zone and was willing to serve because that's the time that I had. And so that was really cool. But now taking it to where I'm passionate in student ministry is it's actually really cool that you're not the student pastor anymore, because then you are home taking care of our children, and I get to serve freely without worrying about if they're getting all their homework done, or, if they're fighting, how are they going to resolve it? And I just can trust that it's being cared for. And it's been really cool to see how it's grown my faith, and I've been able to teach other students about like having a passion for God's word, but then also seeing how it affects our children, realizing that it's important for mom to minister and to serve, and not just be here all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's the pro tip for this one then?
The pro tip was being okay with serving when your husband isn't. And I have a specific example of why this is important. The other, was it about a month ago, we had a worship night at our church that was led by the student ministry. So I needed to be there, but it was at the campus that Bill is the pastor of. And so it just worked out where I was going because it was youth ministry. But when I got there, I was like, there's so many people here, and it was people that are adults and other people. And so like, I was like, I just felt guilty. Like he should have been there. And I got this great text message back from him that said, it's okay for you to be serving and for me not, like for Bill not to be. And it was just like, it was so like just being able to relieve that stress and realize, okay, it's okay to minister and your husband not be ministering at the same time.
Right. Yeah. And that's, you know, I wish I could tell more and more pastors, like, find a way to champion the ministry that God is calling your spouse to, you know, is so important. Okay.
And not
that was
feel
great.
like you have to be there. Like you could have been like, no, I have to be there. I guess you're going to have to stay home, or we're going to have to find a sitter.
Right.
And we could have, but it was just really nice to feel confident that everything was fine at home. I could serve, and you weren't bitter towards me that you weren't there.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. And that brings us to the last one, which is which is wives, love the church deeply, but will fight for the health of her husband and children. What do you mean by this?
Well, what I've noticed from a lot of other ministry wives or spouses is that they're often not as outgoing or wanting people to notice them personality as their ministry spouse is. And so it might sometimes be viewed as like, they're not quite as passionate about the church. And that isn't true. We really love the church. In fact, we love the church so much that we sacrifice a lot of our family time and even just marriage time so that our spouse can serve the church and church body. So that's kind of we love the church deeply, but we're going to fight for the health of our family and our children and husband, because we notice when things are getting too stressful, when they're getting burnt out, and we care about our family as well. So we're going to make them set boundaries. We're going to remind them to say no to things if it's too crazy, and reminding them to take vacations, even if that means they miss out on a big event or something. So, and then like with our kids, protecting illustrations that are used during sermons, like reminding our husbands to, maybe you shouldn't share that story about so-and-so with their exact name and all the information. So. Yeah,
that's good. Awesome. Well, what an awesome conversation. I'm so glad that you could join us. Jed and I do this thing where at the end we say like one thing, if there was one thing from the content that we talked about today, what would you want people to walk away with? Do you have one thing?
Can I just remind them of the 5 pro tips?
Absolutely.
Okay. So the first one was celebrate holidays on Saturdays. It's important. Number 2, have a good, solid group of people that encourage you, challenge you, and keep you accountable. Number 3, trust God's plan above all else. Number 4, be okay with serving when your husband isn't. And then number 5, we didn't touch on it, but set boundaries. Set boundaries for your family, what activities they do, and also what information is shared. Setting boundaries.
Yeah, that's so good. I love that. I'm going to say that my pro tip is, especially if you're a pastor listening to this, find a way to champion the ministry of other members of your family, right? Not just your spouse, but your kids too. Find ways to not just be the only one doing ministry in your family, but allowing and championing the other members of your family as well. All right. That's it. Thank you so much for joining us, Erica. Thank you everyone for listening and tuning in this week. And of course, we'll catch you all next week.